Welcome everyone to today's live stream. First time Clear Admit has done a live stream, so welcome. And we know that the season is getting underway. In fact, I think Cambridge Judge's deadline might be today. So round one is here and now. Next week, Columbia, Wharton, Harvard have round one deadlines along with London Business School, Duke and Darden. And Notre Dame, I think, have early action deadlines, and I'm
Yeah.
probably missing one or two, but the season is here. So today's live stream is just to sort of answer any questions that folks might have as they sort of fine tune their applications, any questions from us, and so on and so forth. And how we'll do this, we'll just start off, each of us introducing ourselves so that you can get a sense of who you're hearing from. And then we'll just do a Q&A. And if nobody asks any questions, we'll just talk rubbish for about an hour, I reckon, about MBA admissions to top tier business schools. So, Graham, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Graham, co-founder of Clear Admit and co-host of the Clear Admit podcast with Alex every week. We publish those episodes on Mondays. And yeah, as Alex said, we're trying something new. We're just going to do a live stream. It's perfect timing because, as you point out, Alex, there's so many deadlines coming up. So people are probably furiously working and frantically working on their application materials. And so we thought it'd be a good time to allow people to ask us questions. And also just offer some general advice as you approach these deadlines. Alex, I did want to just kind of kick things off with a question for you. That's kind of an age-old question, but what do I do if I'm realizing now, as you point out, all these deadlines are coming, that I'm not going to get everything in on time? So let's say I was going to apply to 5 or 6 schools, and I had planned to apply to all of them in round one, but I'm only going to have time for a few of them. Any advice on like which do I pick, like the ones that I'm most excited about going to? Do I apply to, so just my reach schools in round one and then safeties in round two? Or what's your take on this kind of a thing?
You're a very poor planner, Graham. And now you're starting to think about this situation. That would be my first comment. To this situation. But I mean, what Graham's sort of alluding to is this idea of is round one super important? And if you've got to sacrifice a couple of applications to round two, how do you make that decision? And so on and so forth. And we are big advocates, and I say we, the royal we, sort of Clear Admits, Graham and I, sort of providing a lot of the guidance and so forth. We're big advocates that round one and round two tend to be at par in terms of apply when you're absolutely ready, unless, and the big caveat is if you're potentially from an overrepresented population. And then if that is the case, then yes, I would say round one is more important. So then the question comes, if I am overrepresented and there is a difference between round one and two, which applications should I push to round two? My reach schools, my target schools, my safety schools, one from each bucket. What's the best strategy? And as we talk about this, and I'll bounce it back to Graham in a minute, if you have any questions and it's not related to this response, it could be related to absolutely anything that you're thinking about through the MBA admissions process, so please fire questions into chat. Um, I, it is a bit of a quandary, right? If you're overrepresented, this is an important issue. If you're not overrepresented, I would say rounds one and round two, it doesn't matter. The convenience of round one helps a lot because you hear earlier, you can make decisions based off of what you're hearing post decision. Like you can come up with a round two strategy, right? But other than that, it's more of an issue for overrepresented. Would you agree with that, Graham?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think that if you're underrepresented or just not overrepresented, then there's not a big difference between the two rounds. And I think it is challenging because we also hear that old adage that your first application is almost never your best because
Yeah.
there's that learning curve. So you get into this scenario of like, should you save that top? What I would say is ideally you apply to multiple schools in the first round and maybe the first one you submit is not your number one target, so that you kind of cut your teeth on that first application. But still, if there's a dream school on your list, obviously applying early to that school doesn't hurt you. So yeah, it's challenging, and I know people often have bigger eyes than than stomachs, I guess, in the sense that people have 8 or 10 schools on their list, and then they get into round one and realize they're not going to get it all together in time. So that can be challenging. But frankly, I've never met a recommender that enjoyed writing 10, submitting 10 different recommendations. So often we would advise pare your school list down anyway. But
Yeah.
again, depends on the case.
But GMAX made that recommendation process a bit easier, right?
Agreed. Yeah.
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 Absolutely.
Yeah. And I would argue that, I mean, it has been a struggle. I mean, not a struggle, but that first application tends not to be your best, as Graham has pointed out. But I would argue that actually now, with the additional resources folks have to prepare their applications, that maybe that's less of an issue, whether you're using an admissions consultant or you're adept at using open, Chat GPT. We've obviously got our own little tool and so on and so forth. I think there are resources now to enable you to really present very well right out of the gate, and so forth. And the key to that also is just getting great feedback from folks that know MBA admissions or current MBA students that have been through the process, and so on and so forth. So get as much feedback as you can as you sort of get ready for this journey.
Yeah, and Alex, I want that's a really good segue because you just brought up something that's been on my mind quite a bit, which is this notion of we know that recommendation writers and candidates are all probably relying a little bit on help from AI these days, whether it's for brainstorming or polishing, whatever the case. Those materials are increasingly well presented because of
Yeah,
the ability to quickly get advice and assistance. But one of the things that I keep hearing admissions directors talk about is how the application data forms are this sort of minefield for candidates because the candidates spend all their time on the essays, they prep the recommendation writers, and those writers are doing a good job. And they leave the kind of filling out of the application form till the day before or a few days before the deadline. And those application forms, you and I know, have all these different questions that require kind of quick, short answers and data from your resume to be input. And the schools get quite annoyed when there's this stark contrast in quality between, say, someone's essays or recommendation letters versus the data forms. And it's either laziness on the part of the candidate, or what they really worry about sometimes is when they see kind of sloppy stuff coming in on the data form, they then start to say, oh, so this candidate had so much help from AI that what we're seeing now in the data form is the real measure of that candidate's writing ability, et cetera. So I just want to mention that because I think it's an important point for people not to overlook. And schools have been, I think, increasingly stashing little questions in the data forms and putting more stuff there to make sure that you're, kind of paying attention and to kind of get away from some of that polish. So,
yeah.
in any event, yeah.
I'll answer it a couple of quick ways. I see we've got a question coming in, so I'll let you look at that question and
Sure, sure.
prepare your thoughts whilst I also answer that question. Because I will say, if you're using AI to help you brainstorm your applications, and that's a good place to use AI, as well as fine tuning, so making sure there's no grammatical errors and so forth. I wouldn't use it in the middle, right? I think it's a really good brainstorming tool. And again, our tool is fantastic for that. And it's really good at telling you at the end of the day if this essay ultimately is good. But you should be doing the writing of the essay. I can tell a funny story about that. We're actually innovating a new bot, an interview bot, right? Which will start talking more about in the next couple of weeks, I suppose. But I was trying to test it. So I thought, well, this will be cool. I'll put in my resume and I'll apply to Harvard and I'll do an interview on our interview bot. Well, that obviously didn't work because my resume is terrible
Well, Harvard
relative
wouldn't have
to,
invited you for an interview,
well,
would they?
yeah, well, exactly. So it was completely unrealistic, quite frankly, right? So I thought, well, I've got to go to Chat GPT and create a realistic resume for a candidate applying to top business schools so I can test this bot, right? So I did, and I got a couple of really cool resumes. One's traditional, one's non-traditional. So I thought, well, I'll test the interview bot. So I uploaded the resume, and it started asking me questions about the content in the resume. Well, my answers were dreadful because I'd never actually had those experiences, right? So the feedback from the interview bot was, looks like you might have done some interesting things, but clearly you're just wishy-washy, no depth, etc., etc. The point I'm trying to make here is, at the end of the day, you can overly polish everything with AI, but it's still your substance and your experiences, etc., that have got to live through these essays and in the interview process and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But back to the data form, what I've seen, and I can track how people are using our AI bot, all anonymously, but I look at the prompts in an anonymous fashion. And I see folks tackling these data forms, and they'll say, here's my resume. This is the question on this data form. I've got X characters to respond to this question. Can you help
Right.
me reduce this response to this? And that's a good use case for
Oh yeah.
AI, I think, right?
Yeah, it's perfect.
So I think there are good ways to use AI, is my point, and you can do it also for the data forms. But I think Graham's bigger point was, we spend so much effort on the essays and sort of neglect that same level of effort dedicated to the data forms. And as Graham pointed out, some schools have moved some of their essay questions directly into those data forms. So don't get tripped up
Yeah.
by that.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah.
Claire has a question for you, Graham.
Yeah, no, Claire, thank you so much for tuning in. It's our pleasure to be doing this. So Claire is calling from New York, and she says she's wondering what we have heard or if any thoughts we have about Dartmouth's guaranteed interview
I can answer
deadline.
this question. Yes,
Give it a
only
shot.
because, not to interrupt you, I'll let you provide a much more thoughtful answer. But I was looking, one of my projects at Clear Admit is to looking at all the dates and the deadlines, the interview deadlines, etc., etc. And yes, Tuck is somewhat unique. There might be one or two other programs like this, but if you apply by a certain earlier deadline, you will be guaranteed an interview. My advice is, if you're keen on Tuck, apply by that earlier deadline so that you get that interview. If you apply by the regular deadline and you're a very good candidate, you'll still get the interview. But why put yourself at risk unless your application won't be super strong by that earlier deadline? I think that's what you're referring to, Claire. But I think, yes, Harvard, sorry, Tuck does that. Some of these early action deadlines sort of guarantee interviews by the, if you apply for that deadline and so forth. But getting a guaranteed interview, Kellogg effectively interviews most folks, although I think they might have backed off that a little bit last season. But yes, anyway, long story short, if you can get your application in by that guaranteed interview deadline. Graham?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think Tuck, Tuck is one of these places where it's a very specific community, and they're looking for commitment from people who are interested in them. And obviously, going up to Hanover to visit if you can is a great signal, but getting in for that early deadline to guarantee an interview is a great way to just demonstrate that they're a priority for you. So, yeah, we do see other schools doing this from time to time. And as you say, Alex, it seems like some schools pull it in, push it back out. Like Kellogg or Duke had this for a while. I can't remember if they have it this year, but there are schools that have those guaranteed. And I would say if you can make it, do it. Having an interview also at Tuck is a great opportunity to connect with a current student. I believe it's mostly current students doing those interviews, and yeah, it's just a great way to kind of immerse yourself in what they have to offer. So I would do it. Alex, we have another question here, so I'm going to pull Claire's, and we've got this next one, which is from Dr. Dre Mate. What's the best way to report AI use? And I think this relates a little bit to, we have a question from Magna below about HBS. So a lot of these schools are saying, how are you using AI? And they're asking you to like explicitly tell them because they want to know what sort of, use you're making of it. So Alex, what would you say? Like, why is HBS asking this question? And we've had a
Yeah.
few questions on like, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I'll turn it back to you real quick, Graham, before going to the specifics of this particular question. But you hosted a lot of these top schools in these essay workshop events over the summer, and
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. And you had a specific question, or at least they all seem to address this particular question, right? They recognize that candidates are going to be wanting to use AI just to make sure they're presenting their best candidacy. So each of the schools, I think, responded to a pretty standard question about this, Graham.
They did. And one thing that's fascinating to me is that a year ago, and even a little bit 2 years ago, but mostly a year ago, there was a much more kind of divided approach. Like some schools were like, no, don't use ChatGPT. This is your work, be authentic. This year, they all seem, I don't know if resigned is the right word, but they all are kind of like, we know it's out there, we know you're using it. But there's still a distinction in that some schools are like leaving it at that. Other schools like HBS are saying, tell us how you've used it. And there are quite a few schools that fall into that bucket. So what would you say if you're asked, Alex? I mean,
I would be very transparent in terms of how I used it. I would absolutely tell them that I used MBA, Clear Admit bot, because I support Clear Admit, and their bot's
yeah.
probably the best AI tool out there in terms of helping me. But but no, again, use it for brainstorming ideas. Use it for getting feedback on your resume. Use it for getting feedback on ideas for responding to specific school essay prompts based off of your resume. But then write your essays based off of the ideas that have been generated for you, right? So I would say the best sort of use case is think of the AI tool as a friend or a colleague who's helping you brainstorm your way through the process. And then you can use it to sort of fine tune aspects of the aspects of your essays and resume and so forth. I don't see that's a problem. And you might want to use it as a spell checker or a sophisticated grammar checker or whatever it might be. But don't have it just draft your essay. That's just really it's not going to be authentic, right? I think a lot of what you learned, and you knew this anyway, obviously, Graham, but a lot of the conversation that you have when you do these essay workshops is that schools want to know the authentic you through the admissions process. They've designed these essays to understand the authentic you. So use the AI to help you optimize for revealing the authentic you would be my thing. And if HBS is saying, how did you use AI? Be very straightforward in how you used it.
Yeah, and someone asked specifically, like, what do you give them like bullet points or do you write out sort of a short answer? I think it probably a short answer is fine. You can just say, AI was sort of helpful in bookending my approach to the admissions process. I
Yeah,
used it at the start to brainstorm, to look at my resume and give me sort of ideas. And then I used it at the end after I'd written my materials to get some
yeah.
feedback and grammatical polish. I think
I
that's
mean, I mean,
fine.
yeah. Here's a point, Graham. Right? Let's say a school has an essay prompt that says, "Tell me about your most significant, whatever it might be, or your biggest learning experience, or whatever."
Mhm.
Right? Well, you put your CV or whatever into the AI bot and ask the CV, looking at everything that I've done, how would you, what source material would you think is appropriate for this response, right? So something like that, and then you develop the response, and then maybe go back to the bot and say, just give me, two or three highlights of what's good in this response, and maybe one or two development areas that I need to fix in this response, right? So
Okay, so and actually, Magna is making a really important point here, which is I haven't seen the HBS data form this year, but apparently it says you have to say yes or no. Have you used AI in completing the
yeah,
application? Um, and it says, use of AI is permitted, but you should not claim AI output as your own independent
yeah,
work. So, yeah, I mean, personally, my suspicion, if I'm HBS and I can ask Dana next time I connect with her, my suspicion is that if you tick the box yes, they're not going to reject you, but they might ask you in the interview, like to expand on what we're using it for. But again, I think if you're honest and frank about, oh, I used it to brainstorm, I used it to check my essays for grammatical mistakes, it's perfectly fine. And the schools know this. I mean, I've talked
Yeah.
with all of them. None of them have said, oh, what a disaster to use, these tools. I mean, the only thing they've said consistently is don't have it write the essays, that would
Yeah.
be a real next level kind of laziness. Um, so, so I would avoid that. But I
And
don't think,
and
yeah,
and you got to think about it also very logically, right? What portion of the applicant pool are using consultants to help them fine tune and optimize their essays and brainstorm their essays? And what's the difference between using a consultant and using an AI bot, right? I
yeah,
don't see there's any material difference. You're getting support, you're getting outside support to optimize your candidacy. As
right.
long as you're not just making stuff up because the AI says, well, actually, if you work for this company, that would look a lot better, and you
Right.
suddenly edited your resume to reveal then you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Yeah,
Yeah, just to play devil's advocate. So there was a time when admissions consulting was like the biggest kind of fear, of an admissions officer. They didn't like that consultants were out there, and I wondered, um, there were some schools at the time who put a question in their form, which was, "Did you work with an admissions
yeah,
consultant? Yes or no?" And there was a lot of debate at the time about what do you say to that, yes or no. You want to be honest, but also if you think it's going to bias them against you, people were like, why should I tell them? What about people who don't tell them and are using one? And so this is, I mean, I do think it's kind of an unfair question. Like I would put it in the bucket of like, what other schools are you applying to? And like it's sort of, it's hard because there will be people out there who tick the no box on the HBS application, even though they've used it. And there won't be necessarily a way for HBS to verify that. So it's challenging. I think it creates a challenging environment for candidates. But
yeah.
I mean, I kind of feel like
People,
honesty is the best policy.
yeah, people could check no, they didn't use it, right? Really bad essays, and the HBS person would say, well, you should have used AI. Clean this up. So it's like,
Yeah, and
and
yeah,
apparently, and I think once you check the box, I think somebody's noted that you then get a space to say how you used it. Yeah,
all right, yeah. Thanks, Dr. Dre, mate, for
yeah,
pointing that out. So yeah, so if you hit yes, it sounds like you get a chance
yeah,
to
yeah,
expand it. And again, if you can expand upon it, I would absolutely just talk about how it bookended your
yeah,
process. And I don't think you should be using it to write your essays anyway. So
yeah, yeah.
um,
And again, if let's say you got a candidate, a non-traditional candidate, right? They're not surrounded by other consultants or other bankers or tech workers or whatever that are going to MBAs in large numbers. They don't have sort of that ecosystem around them that can really help them fine tune their own profile and candidacy. Well, having an AI support might be a nice replacement and really enable non-traditional candidates to see the value that they're bringing to this process and so forth. So I would argue that as non-traditionals,
yeah.
AI might actually have a much bigger a bigger impact for them. Yeah,
Yeah, that's fair. And just while you're mentioning it, since I know you've been kind of plugging it as we've been chatting, but we do have a bot that we built, a custom sort of uh, chat
yeah,
bot that's built on ChatGPT, but with our own content. And
yeah,
and I think it's fantastic. And schools that have looked at it have also told me, wow, this is pretty impressive. And it's because we have so much content on our website, interviews with
yeah,
admissions directors, webinars, everything we do has been put into our LLM. But what's cool is you can actually upload a file now to the
yeah,
bot. So you can upload your resume, you can upload an essay, and get feedback. So it's pretty cool, and that's a
yeah,
newer feature that we rolled out in the last week or so. I have a great question again from Dr. Draymate, which is, what percentage of applicants to Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton are high quality? So Alex, I mean, you spent many years reading files at Wharton. What's your take on that?
70 or 80%,
Yeah, I
I would
tend to
say.
agree. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean that's the thing that made that job so difficult because I read at Wharton too, and yeah, there are clunkers. I mean, there is that
yeah,
30% where you're like, whoa, why is this person even, I mean, they're just not qualified, right? But then it gets really hard. And obviously there's a small percent that are clear admits. I mean,
yeah,
that's where we got the name for our company, people who are just obvious superstars. But then there's this giant gray area of people who are totally qualified, could
yeah,
survive the curriculum, contribute, and so then it comes down to, well, how are they presenting themselves and what are the stories they're sharing and how do they do in the interview and what are the, some of the numbers. But yeah, frankly, there are a lot of qualified people. And that's why, even with some of the fluctuations in application volume, these programs like Harvard, they could fill their class, several times over each year with qualified
Yeah.
candidates. So that's why they're still, able to pick out, great candidates. So that's my take on that. Anything you want to add
Yeah,
on
and
that one?
I'll add too that you'll get candidates that get denied at Booth and get admitted at Harvard,
Yeah.
get denied at Columbia, get admitted to Stanford, et cetera, right? So it's not a very clinical, logical, whatever process. There is this sort of, I'm not going to call it a black box because, I mean, there's clearly really identifiable attributes that AdCom are looking for. But maybe the candidate, when they applied to Booth, didn't make a really good connection with why Booth was the best MBA to get them to where they wanted to be. But they felt that for, let's say, Harvard, and articulated their profile much more clearly when they applied to Harvard, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just one silly example, but you will get the not anomalies, because there'll be quite a few of them, that maybe they didn't get admitted to the second half of the M7, but got admitted to the top half. And you'd think
Yeah.
on the surface that doesn't make a lot of sense, but actually it's more about how they presented themselves and so forth. And that's why the admissions process is ultimately so important, making sure your essays do the best authentic job of revealing who you are and what's important to you, et cetera, your attributes, your growth, impact, and so on. And so forth. But yeah, I could talk all day on this subject. So
Yeah.
I think we can change, but you have more to add, Graham?
Oh, just one kind of small point, which is that, yeah,
Yeah,
it's not a science. And I think sometimes, especially for maybe more traditional candidates who are of a business mind and work with
yeah,
numbers all day, they're sort of like, oh, I've got these numbers. This is the
yeah,
formula. I'm going to get in. But there's a significant portion that's,
yeah,
art to it. And so, yeah, you
yeah, yeah,
find, anomalies and people not getting into all the top schools. We've got some really good questions from Claire.
yeah,
Again, and about interviewing, and these are really great questions. I'm so glad, Claire, that you're asking these. So um, it's all kind of related, but basically, she wants to understand what what's the point of the interview? What are they trying to do? And
yeah,
what percentage of candidates are they interviewing? And is the interview like a final step? Sort of like they know they want
yeah,
to accept you and it's this last hurdle, or is it actually a determining factor? So Alex, why don't you take a stab at this? Because I
yeah,
think the answer is yes and yes and no and
yeah,
no. And so I mean it
yeah,
varies
yeah.
from school to school quite
Yeah,
dramatically.
so we take a bit of a step back. The whole admissions process. So first of all, you're submitting your application, and let's assume, Claire, that you're not getting the guaranteed interview at this case. Although I do encourage you to take that opportunity, right? But let's assume you're doing a regular admissions process. You submit your application, and it gets read by at least one person, probably two people. Probably in 5 years' time, AI will be reading it, but that's a whole nother conversation. But you get read by a couple of people, and they'll have some insight. They'll have written up some stuff. There'll be some overall summary of your overall profile, and then a decision: shall we interview or not? So let's say you move forward to the interview. For most schools, that puts you in the top 50%. Let's say. And for Harvard, it puts you in the top 20%, right? So it varies from school to school, but on the whole, it's about the top 50% then get interviewed. For most schools, the interview will the interviewer, I should say, will write up their own review of your candidacy, completely independent of the previous reading reviews. So you're effectively getting a third voice in your application that ultimately will yield the final result. Now, you would imagine that someone that has a really strong application also has a really strong interview report, which is what we call them at Wharton, interview report, right? So really strong interview report, because they're bound to be correlated. Why did you have a strong application? Because you had really interesting experiences showing growth and impact, et cetera, et cetera. You really aligned well with your goals. You made a very strong case with why this school and so forth in your written application. And you do the same through the interview, right? So there has to be a high degree of correlation in that case. So I wouldn't say that the decisions are already made before the interview. So there are anomalies where the interview report comes back and says, well, actually, this person's a complete jack, whatever, and don't admit them for anything. They're arrogant and so on and so forth. They didn't
Yeah.
come across as arrogant on paper, but in person, that was a completely different story, right? So the interview has a pretty big voice in this final decision because it's the last sort of hurdle, as it were. But they're usually quite well correlated. There'll be some anomalies in the process, but that's the sort of general process.
And
Graham?
yeah, and I do think, I mean, yeah, I just want to draw a really stark distinction between, say, HBS or MIT, where
Yeah,
steep cut, they're bringing in the people that they're really excited about, and it's quite a challenging interview. It's a behavioral interview, it's a application based interview, so very in depth, right? Versus say Tuck, where there's a guaranteed interview, you're going to meet with a second year student, or some schools where you're meeting with alums. I mean, these are different interview processes, but it varies, from school to school. And so you need to know, who's interviewing you. But to Claire's point, she mentions, and I think we have it up on screen here, but she's saying, yeah, that she's wondering, like, how does someone who's just graduated, recently, and is interviewing you, how could they have much sway?
yeah,
But the truth is, these schools put a lot of stock in what their current or recent community members would have to say,
yeah,
because they're on the ground, and so they've been through the program, and they try to get a sense as to how you might fit. In fact, at Wharton, we would instruct second year students who were doing interviews at the time when I was working there. We'd say, imagine whether you would want this person on your learning team in the first year. Would you want to travel through the core curriculum with them, do projects with them? So I know it's hard to sort of be like, wow, this person's just like 2 years older than me or 3 years older than me. What can they possibly say? But these folks matter. And usually the ones that are alums who are interviewing had good relationships with the admissions committee to begin with. They were active on campus. So these are trusted, kind of grads of the program. So I would not take it lightly. Even if there are some schools where it's a bit more informal, it's just a resume based interview, it's a conversation, it still all matters. And I would also, one final point on interviews, every admissions director I've talked to in the last 6 months has said that the interview is becoming increasingly important to them because it's the one moment that they get to have the real you without AI, without any kind of influence necessarily, because they get to have a conversation with you. So I would be, yeah, focusing on doing a great job in the interviews.
yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's
So
have a look. Yeah,
yeah,
another
we
question
have
come in.
yeah, we have a question again from Dr. Draymate, which is about, let me just put it up here. Um, let's see. There we go. So he's in a he or she really interesting predicament about kind of current job for a handful of months, and they've had three different managers. Makes you think of that movie Office Space, where the person has like 12 managers, and they can't figure out like who's going to write that second rec. And they do say, um, where is it? Yeah, they say below that their first rec is coming from like a prior boss. So that's okay. But for their second rec, they want to use kind of their current position, but they've had all these different managers over the last few months. So what would you do in that case, Alex? I mean, how do they're worried that, picking someone who's been managing them for just a couple of months or something is going to be
No,
challenging.
I think this is a very interesting question. It also brings up the question, what I mean, we're remote workers, Graham. Some folks have never actually worked in an office and actually met their recommenders live or
Right.
anything like that, right? So
Yeah.
the world is different now in terms of how you build those relationships and so on and so forth with your recommenders. And I think AdCom obviously fully um, aligned with that. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, first recommendation, previous boss, that makes a lot of sense. Only 5 months into the new position. Um, so the challenge is, what about the second recommender? I think what I would do is certainly include a short paragraph in the optional essay just to explain the broader context, right? So if you've cycled through three bosses, settling into the new job, etc., so that at least the AdCom understands how you made this choice and why the principal recommender is from your previous situation. Um, yeah, other than that, Graham, I'm not sure what other insight to add other than are there other options in terms of other sort of mentors or various other folks that you've engaged with over your professional career, I wouldn't go back to undergrad or anything like that, except under really unusual circumstances. But you really do want someone to weigh in that really knows your work product and is hopefully championing your desire to go pursue an MBA. And that might be challenging in of itself if you've only been somewhere a short period of time, because they might not want you to be
To leave.
departing anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, many candidates manage to combine a professional
Yeah,
rec letter with a something from an outside community activity or something
yeah,
they've been involved with. But that, typically you have to be very involved for it to meet the sort of, to come to that level of import to be where someone could write a rec. Like if you've been fundraising for an organization that's raising money for charity or, doing something that's been big enough where there's enough sort of meat on the bones to talk about in the letter of recommendation. But otherwise, I think your advice here in the case of this question is good. You just explain in the optional essay, but ideally identify that manager who's maybe going to be sympathetic to your desire to go get an MBA, and maybe it's
yeah,
someone in your at work who gets that.
yeah.
But yeah, I understand it. Schools understand this. I mean, they know that life's not perfect, and frankly, my guess is that what would happen is that they would rely a bit more on that first rec. Um, and
Yeah,
understand the context, but you got to provide that context. Uh,
yeah.
let's move on. We got a question here from Megna. Really appreciate. We've had some folks asking multiple questions. Really appreciate these questions. So we've got any tips for how to do your final self-review of a full application before submitting, things to watch out for, suggestions for using the Clear Admit bot to do this. What do you say, Alex?
I would put the whole thing into one PDF, upload it to our bot, and say, please give me a final review. I'm applying to whichever school. Um, identify 3 highlights, but identify 2 areas that perhaps I need to develop or something like that, and just see what sort of feedback you get. But at the end of the day, I think people overly overthink that everything has to be perfect, right? In terms of, as long as you believe your final product represents you very well, I would just then go submit the application. But yeah, I don't think there's any harm of putting the whole thing into one PDF, and maybe the bot would just catch 1 or 2 inconsistencies that would help you just sort of fine tune it a little bit, right? But I wouldn't rely on a bot to rewrite the whole thing or anything like that, because then we get into more of the gray area of how you're using this stuff. But I'm
Mhm.
a big believer these bots can provide you really good insight on a couple of areas of development or inconsistencies. So stick it all into one PDF and have a go.
Yeah, I would say two things. Number one, go back to what you did at the beginning of this process, which is think about what's your elevator pitch for your candidacy? What are the
Yeah,
3 to 5 points that you would want? If I'm sitting down at the cafeteria for lunch with the dean of admissions at HBS and she's just read your file, and I say, "Hey, you just read Megna's file. What was she about again?" And like, what would surface from that, read? And so you then would go back and say, "Okay, is this application doing that? Is it bringing out the 3 to 5 key
yeah,
points about me?" That I'm an amazing academic student, that I had this incredible leadership experience at work, and and that I have these really unique goals, or and that I'm a sushi chef in my spare time, or whatever it is, right? Just making sure that comes out. And then the other thing I was just thinking about is we hear, and we heard this over and over again when we did our little application workshops with the admissions directors. Um, they don't like playing detective. So you could potentially use AI or do a read through with the bot to just look for, is there anything that's like unclear, like gaps in the timeline, or am I not, would anything be sort of fuzzy for the admissions committee? Because admissions directors hate playing detective. They don't want to have to figure out, wait, why was there this gap here? Or you're talking about this job, but when did you leave and go to that one? Or so make sure that things are consistent. And obviously, check it for typos, et cetera. Um, Alex, we have another really good question.
I just want to
Yeah,
get back
go
to
ahead.
your point. You made a great point that I completely missed, right? So when you put this complete PDF into the bot and you prompt it to identify a couple of areas of weakness, add what Graham said. Am I coming across as X, Y, and Z, i.e.,
Right.
my big picture, what I want the adcom to walk away with? I think that's really, really important. And I completely mi- missed that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
yeah, really important. We have an admissions book that we wrote actually several years ago now, but it still has a lot of merit. I think anyone, it's like a very quick read. You can download it for free off of Clear Admit. But we talk about this idea of developing a personal inventory, right? Really taking stock of yourself and everything that you've done and doing a big sort of data dump of all that before you even start the application process. But by going through that process, you should really start to think about, well, all the things that make who you are and so on and so forth. So it's kind of a little bit related to that too. But
Yeah.
but yeah, create a PDF of your final application and get some quick feedback. Yeah.
Yeah. We have another very timely question given the deadline is looming from Usman, which is any pointers on the HBS essays? I have a lot of thoughts on this one, but do you have any thoughts, Alex?
No, I'll let this to you because you host these guys.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the challenges I think with the HBS essays is that you don't have a lot of real estate to use. They have a 300 word and then a couple of 250-word essays, and the questions are quite broad, and so you run into this trouble of this, and this is where I actually think AI can be quite helpful in terms of this need to be, like you were saying earlier, Alex, it's like you have a lot to say. In some of these short answers or even short essays, how do you condense it down to make sure that every word counts and that you're not wasting space? It's because HBS is, I mean, there are three different questions. One's a little bit about your career. One is about kind of leadership experience and how you kind of drive others and lead others. And then the last one is about kind of demonstrating curiosity. So they want people who are accomplished, have a kind of plan, have really, I think innate sort of leadership abilities that they can harness during their time at HBS. And then finally, this sort of curiosity and drive that allows them to kind of make these stepwise like leaps forward, exponential kind of leaps forward. And so it's challenging though, because, if I'm asked in 250 words to tell some big, bold leadership story, that's not a lot of space. I mean, that's like what, not even a page, right? So that's where I think it could be useful to write it at the length that you think you would need to tell the story and then work to kind of trim it back, and maybe AI can help there too. But any thoughts? I mean, HBS has changed these essays fairly dramatically as of a couple of years ago. They used to have a very different approach. They had a kind of one open-ended essay. And in the years before that, they had like 6 essays and tons of real estate, like literally 2,000 words, I think, at one point. And they've really pared it back to less than 1,000 or now, or it's something like, what is it now? Yeah, it's like 800 words total, right? So it's really, really tight. But yeah, any thoughts, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, you know HBS better than me. The only other thing that I would say is HBS is, I'm not saying they're unique by this because you mentioned Sloan and Stern or whatever, but if you get to the interview stage, anything that you've written in your applications, including these essays, is fair game for deep dive sort of questioning, right? So HBS and again, Stern, a couple of others, they will do a application based interview. So the interviewer will have read your application and will come to that interview with specific questions that your essays and resume and everything have raised. So just bear that in mind too. But I think that's a really good thing in my mind. I think that it's a more challenging admissions process for the adcom to put together because it means that the interviewer has to have read your application and so forth. But it's also, I think, a little bit more challenging for the candidate. You've been through an HBS interview, Graham. You sort of remembered even to this day what it was like, right?
Yeah, it was challenging just because it's sort of a peeling of the onion. You think you've
Yeah,
kind of put your best stuff out there in the essays and the application, and then you walk into the room and they want you to go even further and offer a lot more detail. So, yeah, it's challenging in that regard. And they're not easily impressed because they're,
yeah,
getting thousands and thousands of amazing applications every year. So,
yeah.
yeah, so good luck, Usman, with those essays. The next question we've got is, how important is keeping my LinkedIn bio in the application cycle, like keeping the LinkedIn bio up to date during the application cycle? Now, some schools actually do ask you for a link to your LinkedIn profile. I think Sloan might be one of them, but you're right. Not all of them will ask, but they
Yeah.
will. Many of them have admitted to doing that due diligence, even if they don't ask. They will Google you. They will look you up. Who was it? Somebody from UT Austin McCombs mentioned that recently in a session we were doing. So you have to assume that anything out there about you publicly is going to be potentially scrutinized. So I would I would absolutely keep it up to date. It shouldn't take long if you've gone through the application process, because you have to produce a resume in most cases, or at least fill out the data forms with all the sort of LinkedIn type information. So my advice is, yeah, keep it up to date.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's social listening 101, right? Marketing 101, listen, whatever, go to the candidates' social profiles, more specifically LinkedIn, and so on and so forth. So I think that's very important. But this, I like this question, Graham. I'm 100% authentic in my application, and I keep the same level of authenticity in the HBS interview. Uh, Good luck. Hopefully, you get the HBS interview.
Yeah.
I only say that because, again, most schools will interview 50% of their apps. HBS will interview 20 to 25%. They take a
Right.
deeper cut. And I do believe one of the reasons why they take the deeper cut is because from a resource issue, the interviewer then has to read the file and so on. So there's just more work on their part. Anyway, what are some of the ways I could mess up the conversation piece, suddenly forgetting how to speak? I'll just say a quick um, response to this and then let Graham elaborate. If you're being truly authentic, you can't mess up, right? Because you're presenting yourself, right? So you shouldn't have to think twice about responding to the questions. I mean, it was very difficult for me when I was using the interview bot with my fake resume, trying to answer as a 25-year-old female non-traditional candidate. So my answers weren't very good. But if you're truly authentic and your HBS is querying you about something on your resume, you should really enjoy talking about it. Otherwise, what was it doing on your resume in the first place, right? So I mean, prep hard for the interview, but go in looking forward to telling your story.
Yeah, that's the main thing I was going to say, is that you want to be authentic, but you want to be purposeful in the
Yeah,
answers you give, and well thought out. So what I would recommend is, there's this fine line. I can't remember who it was. I think it was Bob Ailing, former admissions director at Wharton, who told me that there are three ways that he feels like candidates come into an interview. The first is they've done nothing. They're just walking in, and he's like, what I love about those interviews is that those candidates they're pretty authentic. But often they're not very polished and they haven't thought about what they want to say. So they miss valuable opportunities to share things because they kind of are rambling. And then he said another way people come in is they're really well prepared. They've thought about all the questions they might be asked. They're able to walk me through experiences they've had, and they're, just well organized, and everything's kind of tied up in a bow. And those are the candidates that really kind of set the mark. And then he said, but there's another way. And unfortunately, most people come in to the application process this way, is they've done a little bit of prep, but not quite enough to, be polished. So they're neither authentic nor polished, because they're kind of halfway caught. It's like, they're caught in this no man's land. So I would advise that if you do, like Alex says, if you're fortunate enough to get an interview at HBS, know your application inside and out. Look at our interview archive. We have this archive on our
yeah,
website that's free. It has thousands of interview reports in there, and hundreds of Harvard interview reports. You can go and read them. These are literally reports from people who've interviewed at HBS saying, these were the questions I was asked. And you'll quickly get a sense as to the type of things that they ask about. But you need to be ready, and sometimes using the STAR method or different ways of organizing your thoughts when answering a deep question about an experience you've had can be very useful. So that's my advice. But yeah, authenticity is important, but you got to be ready as well for the questions.
yeah. No,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah,
yeah. All right. We got a question. Last question here from Claire. Claire, we don't mind you asking these questions. It's great. They've been really great. So she wants to elaborate on for us to elaborate on the MIT behavioral interview. She said she didn't know it would be different than Tuck. So do you want to talk just briefly, Alex, about these different styles of interview?
yeah. They're no different.
Ah,
That's my response. But I will give MIT credit for being the first school to really focus on behavioral interview styles, right? So you've got resume-based interviews, behavioral-based. So how did you respond to this situation? How, et cetera, right? But effectively, most interviews will include behavioral questions, will include all your why MBA, why talk, why now sort of type questions. Will include questions related directly about sort of tell me about your resume, give me a walkthrough of your career to date, and so on and so forth. So there isn't a lot of diversity in the types of questions you're getting asked at a lot of the different schools, with the exception of a school like Harvard that does do a deep push in sort of niche areas of your CV, and so forth. So yeah, I give Sloan massive credit for sort of weaving in the behavioral approach to these MBA interviews, but most other schools have followed. Much like, and we mentioned this maybe on the podcast a month or two ago, Stern sort of were the first to bring in this idea of emotional intelligence, go figure, back in the early 2000s, late 1990s, as a lens to really investigate MBA candidates, right? And now emotional intelligence, all schools absolutely value emotional intelligence and so forth, as they should. So yeah, I wouldn't overly stress. Now with Sloan, they are a little bit more like HBS in as much as the interviewer will likely have read your application and have more focused questions than perhaps what we call a blind based interview. Might be Darden. It's either Darden or Duke. Won't take your resume. Like the interviewer won't even have your resume when they do the interview. Most
Pardon.
schools will have at least the resume to bounce questions back and forth and so forth. But then you'll have the likes of Harvard, possibly a little bit of Sloan, and that's actually the interviewer knows a lot more about you before you walk through the door.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think the Tuck interview is going to be conversational and
Yep.
just a sort of resume walk. Tell me about yourself, kind of very basic. And what's beautiful about that is it allows you to kind of basically say the same stuff that you spent a lot of time assembling into your application, because the person interviewing you, this alum or second year student, whoever it might be, they haven't read your file. So you have all that material at your disposal. Whereas when you walk into an MIT or a Harvard interview that's non-blind, they've already read all that stuff. So it's like usually sort of tell me something else, or like they take me one level beyond. And so that's what can be challenging. But yeah, behavioral just means, I mean, the big thing with MIT and a few other schools out there is they're very focused on the fact that your past behaviors are the best predictor of your future behaviors. They're not going to listen to what, and in fact, MIT is one of those schools that often says, we don't really want to hear what you say you're going to do in the future. We want to know what you've done so far, and we're going to use that to decide what we think you're going to be able to do in the future. So it's a little different. But anyway, yeah, very good question, Claire. No problem with asking us multiple questions. We've had fun answering them. Good one from Savvy. Do you know this off the top of your head? I have a ballpark, but interview rates for Wharton and Stanford.
I'd say 50% at Wharton. Stanford, I assume, is less.
Yeah, I think it's more like 40 at Wharton.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, Stanford is less, although it's not quite as low as Harvard. So I
Yeah.
think I'd want to say in that 30+% range. But
Yeah.
it's the trick with Stanford is that they sort of trickle them out, and they match you to an alum who interviews
Yeah.
you, and so it's a kind of longer
Yeah.
process. Whereas schools like Wharton and HBS, they issue the interview invitations in one fell swoop, so it's very easy. Everyone knows, oh, on this day we're going to find out if we got an interview. I mean, in some cases in the past, HBS has had like 2 dates where they issue them, but I think they've moved mostly to 1 now, right? So,
Yeah.
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 So let's
So,
see.
Graham,
Yeah,
we've got
and
2 more questions. So I tell folks we only got time to take the 2 more questions.
yep.
I've really enjoyed this, so I appreciate all the questions that have come in. But there we go. So this is our penultimate question. Over to you, Graham. If I think the only part of my application I could improve is in the short term is my GMAT, should I wait to apply for round two, or just postpone until the next cycle if I can't make that improvement? And that's going from the 85th percentile to the 94th percentile.
Boy, I mean, it's context is so important. So for example, if you're an underrepresented candidate working in a niche industry that's going to add something to the class that's, maybe missing, then going from the 85th percentile to 94th may not be as important. If you're, I don't know, I'm just going to pick on, let's say, an Indian male engineer or something that's overrepresented in the pool, then those numbers could really matter. And I would also argue that, I mean, we know from this person's previous comments that maybe they're looking at HBS, but it depends on the schools as well, right? So the level of competition is different at different schools. But I mean, I would say if you're not overrepresented, then I'd buckle down, retake the test, and apply in round two. Um, but again, it depends on school selection and the rest of your profile, and maybe I don't know which test you're taking. If it's it's GMAT here, not GRE. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what an 85th percentile translates to off the top of my head in terms of the raw total score. Is that like a 685, or is it something worse than that? So that would be good to know too. But in any event, I think context is important. School selection, your candidacy. But yeah, applying in round two could be okay if you think you can get a much better score.
But I wouldn't wait till next cycle,
No, I
right?
don't
If
think
you're not
there's a
if you're
reason
not
to.
successful this cycle, then knuckle down, get a better test score, or do whatever else you've got to do to improve your profile and come back as a reapplicant. And the admit rate for reapplicants tends to
Very
be,
high.
not always, but tends to be higher than first-time
Yeah,
applicants for
that
lots of very good reasons.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I would definitely, take the test again, and if not, so I would still apply in round two because there's no
Yeah,
harm in being a reapplicant. And
yeah,
by then, if you do have to reapply, one bonus will be you will have had ideally your supervisor for a bit longer,
yeah.
because they had mentioned earlier they've had all these different supervisors, so maybe they'll build more relationship there.
Last question, Graham, and we thought we were going to avoid this whole sort of geopolitical conversation, but that's not to be the case. But what are your thoughts about foreign students looking to apply this year? I would just say good luck. No, I'm kidding. Best to have a contingency outside the US. So does this play well for LBS, for INSEAD, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, I mean, again, some of this is candidate specific. So, what country are you applying from, right? If you're applying from Canada or England, I don't think there's really any issue about there's probably not a need to be concerned about getting a visa. If you're applying from a country that like the Trump administration has on some list, then maybe there are concerns, and having that sort of contingency plan would be smart. But I like to think that, I mean, look, the top schools are still very interested in getting, I mean, they've said it. I mean, most of these schools have made public statements indicating that they are still very interested in attracting diverse international student bodies to their programs. And if anything, I think um, they're even more kind of conscious of the need for that in this current environment. So I wouldn't worry, but I do think applying in the first round, you don't want to really wait, because the visa process, as we saw this past year, got slowed by the Trump administration because they were introducing new social media checks, or they literally shut down interviews for visas for like a 4-week period. So I think being early would be smart. And then sure, maybe a contingency plan, look at a school overseas, or in Canada or Europe, or wherever you might be interested in top MBA programs. But again, the schools doors are still open for business, and they really want international students. And so I think, yeah, just make sure you apply early and get that visa process, started earlier.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Graham, we're near the top of the hour. Do you want to wrap things up?
Yeah, no, this has been great. Really, big thanks to Aditya, Dr. Dreymate, Savvy, Claire, and Megna for asking all those great questions. It's been fun hanging out, Alex, and yeah, we'll try and do this again. Yeah, stay tuned. We'll keep everyone posted. In the meantime, check out the site. Use the bot that we've built. It's so much fun. Alex and I had a lot of time testing and working to build this, with others on our team. But yeah, thanks for your time, Alex. This has been fun.
No, absolutely brilliant. And thanks to the rest of the ClearMit team for setting this up. And good luck, everyone. And hopefully we repeat this live stream on a monthly basis or something like that. That's kind of the intent of
That's the
what we're
plan.
going to try to do. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. Take care, everyone. Good luck.